In Unit 4, we will discuss how to prepare mortgage-ready borrowers. This unit includes how to assess a client's level of affordability, determining the costs of homeownership, comparing loan products, submitting an application and getting pre-approved for a mortgage loan, selecting a home, reviewing final documents with your client prior to closing, and topics of interest to cover after closing with your clients. So let's start with this idea of lending money. Imagine your cousin wants $3,000 to buy a motorcycle. And think about what would you want to know before you decide if you're willing to lend this money to your cousin. Personally, I would want to know, does my cousin have a job? Do they have a history, does he or she have a history of keeping their jobs? And are they responsible in the workplace? I would also want to know, does my cousin have some money in savings? Is he going to provide money for a down payment, or is the $3,000 the total purchase price of the motorcycle? What is my cousin considering for a payment schedule for paying me back? I'd also want to know, does my cousin have any other debts? Is he making the payments on time for those other debts? And will it be affordable for him to make an additional payment to me on a regular basis, considering those other debts that he has? I also want to know about the motorcycle. I want to know what its value is and the condition of the motorcycle, maybe the year, and if he's going to have insurance coverage that's sufficient to replace the motorcycle if there's an accident. So when we think about all these things that we want to know when a family member wants to borrow money from us, that's very similar to how a loan officer or a lending institution decides if a borrower is worthy of borrowing money to purchase a home. So when a lender is looking at these same ideas that we just discussed for our cousin, they would call it the 4 C's of lending. So capacity is the borrower's ability to pay. What's your income? Do you have a stable job history? Capital would be the funds that you have available. Do you have money in savings? Do you have enough to make a down payment, and how much? How long have you had those funds in savings? Credit is the debt history that the person has and the amount of their debts. And would it be possible for the borrower to make a mortgage payment in addition to maintaining those debt payments that they already have? Collateral is about the house, the home's value and condition. We're going to go on to discuss a client's level of affordability and how to calculate that. To determine mortgage readiness, so when we think about, so far in this course we've discussed how to start an analysis of our clients, including their intake forms and so on, and gathering documentation and doing a budget, assessing their income, and looking at their credit report. Once you've completed those steps and the action plan, then you'd want to assess their ability to qualify for a mortgage loan. So we need to have the following documents, including their income, their savings, subsidy or grant funds that might be available in your community. When we mention subsidy, we're talking about any type of financial assistance programs. We want to have documentation of their monthly debt, their credit, and we'll also want qualifying ratios for loan products and subsidies, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. We would get this information from local lenders and from subsidy providers. So let's get into calculating ratios. You can, of course, use a mortgage calculator to do this, but we'd like you to have the background information of how to do this manually so that you have an understanding of what we're talking about regarding ratios. So when you determine how much to lend an applicant, lenders will use qualifying ratios set by the loan product guidelines. So to clarify, each loan product has a different set of guidelines, and their guidelines include these ratios. So this is something that comes from the lending institution or from the subsidy provider. There are two ratios to be considered: the front-end ratio, or it's also called the housing ratio, and the back-end, or debt-to-income ratio, which is often abbreviated as DTI. The qualifying ratio examples here shows how the ratios are written in loan guidelines. For example, 28/36 refers to a loan which has a maximum housing ratio of 28% of the borrower's monthly income and a maximum debt-to-income ratio of 36%. Let's look at a visual representation of these ratios. First, the whole pie represents 100% of the borrower's gross monthly income. Next, let's look at the blue portion. This represents that 36% of the borrower's gross monthly income is to pay for the housing payment, which includes the principal, interest, taxes, and insurance, as well as mortgage insurance and homeowners association dues, if those are required. Next, let's look at the red portion. This represents 6% of the pie, which in this example includes all the other debts that are reported to the credit bureaus. This could be credit cards, an auto loan or two, student loans, any other debts that the person is paying on or owes. Now, if you look at both the blue and the red sections together, you'll notice that that is identified as the debt-to-income ratio, meaning all of the debt payments that the person has, including their house payment and the other 6%. So 36% plus 6% would be 42% of their total gross monthly income is paying for all of their debts. The green section represents the money that's left over for living expenses, for groceries, entertainment, eating out, children's expenses, home repairs, utility costs, etc. So if you look at this chart and you realize that that 6% depends a lot on a person's choices with their spending. And that 6%, that red portion, if that's larger, then a lender would require, for example, if their debt-to-income ratio for a loan product is 42%, and if, let's say, a person has 10% of their gross monthly income going towards these types of debts, such as credit cards and auto loans and student loans, then that means that you would have to reduce the amount that they're allowed to pay for a house down to 32% of the gross monthly income. So if one piece of the pie is larger, that affects the other pieces of the pie. So first let's talk about the front-end ratio, which is also called the housing expense ratio. This refers to the maximum percentage of gross monthly income allowed by the lender or the subsidy provider to be devoted towards the total housing payment. To calculate this, you would take the gross monthly income, multiply it by the housing ratio, again, which is provided by the lender or the subsidy provider, and that equals the maximum allowed housing payment. And again, that housing payment includes principal, interest, taxes, insurance, mortgage insurance, and the homeowners association dues if that's required. Now let's look at the back-end ratio, or the debt-to-income ratio. I forgot to mention that they're called front-end and back-end because of how they're written in lending guidelines. So when we talked about that 28/36, the 28 refers to the front end and the 36 refers to the back end ratio, simply because of the sequence in which they're written when they're noted. So the back-end ratio, or debt-to-income ratio, refers to the maximum percentage of gross monthly income that a lender or subsidy provider will allow to be devoted towards the total monthly debt, including the house payment. So you would take the gross monthly income, multiply it by the debt-to-income ratio, and that equals the maximum housing payment plus all the other debt payments. To calculate a maximum housing payment that the borrower can qualify for, the lender will use the lower of the following, or the lesser. The housing payment as calculated by the housing ratio, or the housing payment after subtracting the monthly debt obligation from the total debt allowed by the debt-to-income ratio. So let's look at an example. In this example, the borrower's monthly income is $3,416. Their monthly debt payments are $250. The housing, or front-end ratio, for this loan product is 31%, and the debt-to-income, or back-end ratio, is 41%. So first, let's take 31% of their monthly income, and that would equal $1,059. That's the maximum allowed principal, interest, taxes, and insurance based on the front-end ratio. Second, let's take the back-end ratio, the debt-to-income ratio of 41%, and multiply that by their monthly income to get $1,401. And that would be the maximum allowed PITI plus monthly debt. Our next step is to take the maximum debt allowed of $1,401 that we just calculated in step 2 and subtract their actual current debt of $250. That leaves $1,151 left for a potential housing payment. Now, a lender would look at this and compare numbers 1 and number 3. The maximum housing front-end ratio would allow $1,059. This family would consider up to $1,151 for their maximum housing payment. However, a lender would allow the lesser of those two. So you would go with the $1,059 as the maximum allowable principal, interest, taxes, and insurance payment. But that's only telling us principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. To calculate the maximum monthly loan payment amount, we would have to isolate principal and interest. So we would use the PITI amount that we just calculated, and we would subtract taxes and insurance, which you would obtain taxes from your auditor's website perhaps, and you can obtain an average insurance cost for your state or for your area from an insurance agent, or you could search for it online. So in this example, we're going to say that monthly taxes and insurance for this property are expected to be $458. The maximum principal and interest we calculated was maximum principal and interest would equal $1,059 PITI that we just calculated minus this $458 estimate for taxes and insurance. That leaves us with $601 for principal and interest. The next step would be to use this maximum principal and interest amount to calculate the maximum mortgage loan amount. So in section 4.3, we'll go on to do that step. After subtracting the taxes and insurance from the maximum payment, the maximum loan amount is calculated. The factor table provides the principal and interest payment per $1,000 loan amount. You can look at the factor table in the manual. You would use this formula, principal and interest divided by the factor, multiplied by 1,000, equals the maximum loan amount. Using the factor table, you can also calculate the monthly loan payment based on a known loan amount and interest rate. You would use this formula of loan amount times the factor and divide it by 1,000 to obtain the monthly principal and interest payment. Again, you can always use a mortgage calculator to do these calculations, but we want you to understand what's behind the calculation, and also to have the option to do this if you don't have a mortgage calculator available.